Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker, shills, Dutch lacers, peasants, vassals, meat sacks. I'm a useful idiot. Welcome. Hey, I want to talk about Israel again. All right, you guys can just unsubscribe now, and you don't have to hear this. But it's not like I'm really picking on Israel. I'm picking on Iran and Israel, and in this case, kind of a historical lesson that shows just how malleable and how multi-layered all these relationships between these countries are. And there's, as we see in current events, all this public posturing. We have all this public posturing in the past and going back 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago. This is nothing new. Posturing for the public. And when what really matters, and this story is no exception, is money, oil, and guns. So what I'm talking about is Israeli arms sales to Iran. And so in spite of all the public posturing, there's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes. And as I brought up in other videos, it's not always conspiracy. It's generally a mix of corruption and conspiracy. And this happens to be that, layers of corruption and conspiracy, and wherever they intermingle. And of course, wherever you have guns and money and oil, there is going to be both corruption and conspiracy. So overall, the big picture of what I want to talk about is the sales of arms to Iran and the Khomeini regime starting in 1981 and continuing past 1986 when the program was revealed. And of course, at the time, Iraq was Israel's main threat. They've since been neutered. But at the time, there was an Iraq-Iran war, and both the United States and Israel tended to play both sides. And also, interestingly enough, Israel was also tied to the Reagan hostage manipulation situation. But let's go back a few years and talk about this connection between the Israelis and the Iranians, because it's a pretty interesting little history. But first of all, we have connections all the way going back to the Shah, of course, in the 1950s, and the governments that were being set up there at the time. Of course, what's the first thing a government needs is a secret, vicious secret police, and the Savak were set up by the CIA and Mossad as early as the 50s in Iran. So this brutal secret police that have a connection going all the way up to the secret services, security services that we have in Iran today, direct lineage. Those kind of people don't go away. Look at Russia. And so anyway, this apparatus was set up. So there's a little more intermingling between these cultures than a lot of people would suspect. And then we go back to 1977, Israel's $1 billion oil for arms deal, a joint Israeli-Iran nuclear-capable surface-to-surface missile. So another interesting footnote in light of certainly discussions that Israel has now about the capabilities. Right now in the news, Iran talking about building these missiles, these capable missiles, and we have deals going all the way back to the Shah in '77, a $1 billion. And as I point out, for oil, Iranian oil for Israeli arms, and no perception of the changing winds in that region and where these weapons can end up, and a pattern that would be repeated as well. And an Israeli defense representative said Israel's pro-Iran policy had been guided by a ravenous hunger for profit rather than by strategic considerations, unquote. And that's exactly what I'm talking about there. It's a conspiracy and corruption, and has to do with greed and weapons industries and oil smuggling and oil industries and exchange of a lot of money. And that's a lot of what drives these things. And so policies of Israel and policies of the United States and policies of countries all over the world end up getting compromised by these layers of corruption, conspiracy, and business interests, and where they intermingle. A good example being where the juxtaposition of the military-industrial complex and the arms industry and driving foreign policy and having low-level conflicts all over the world that need a constant infusion of more weapons. So like I say, going back to Israel selling arms to Iran back in the 70s, the U.S. State Department said whenever we would get word of shipments in the U.S., State Department would raise the issue with Israel, and we would get the standard lectures and promises that there would be no U.S. weapons involved. So the U.S. is mostly concerned that U.S. weapons would end up showing up and be a very embarrassing situation. And in fact, that's what ended up happening eventually. So to the chagrin of the Reagan administration during the 80s, after the fall of the Shah and the takeover of the embassy in Iran and the ushering in the Khomeini era, um, Israel bombed Iraq, invaded Lebanon, annexed the Golan Heights in Syria, and started settling the West Bank on a massive scale. So Israeli policy was very provocative and certainly wasn't conducive to what the Reagan administration had in mind during the 80s. And yet it was during this same period that the Israelis were actively still providing arms through channels to Iran. So a very belligerent atmosphere. And in fact, in 1981, Israel sold $75 million worth of arms to Iran, Operation Seashell, 150 anti-tank guns, 24,000 shells for each gun, spare parts, tanks, and jets, and even tow missiles. Let's remember, once again, this is for Israel to arm Iran to fight Iraq at the time. $500 million worth of arms sales apparently between 1981 and 1983. And again, Iranian oil paid for these weapons, and 80% of the weapons bought by Iran after the Iraq War started were from Israel. So that's a very staggering figure that during the Khomeini regime, which is now labeled, of course, the arch enemy and arch nemesis of Israel, was getting 80% weapons bought by Iran after the Iraq War started were from Israel. And arms shipments from the U.S. and the Iran-Contra affair, which is detailed elsewhere, were also facilitated by Israel. And this was all done once again as well as the United States and Israel both played off each other, played Iran and Iraq off each other, both countries wanting to end up losers for Israeli and U.S. policies. And then between 1984 and 85, massive quantities of TNT were also moved from Israel to Iran through Sweden. Once again, undoubtedly for the war effort, particularly because Iran was always interested in amping up conventional weapons. The Israelis and other bad actors, including the United States, had a lot to do with Iraq getting chemical weapons and then using them on Iran during the war. And of course, this is a great experiment for the military-industrial complexes of these other nations, too, to be able to test out these weapons on people they really don't care about one way or another. And in fact, Reagan worked with Iraq during the war and shared intelligence with Iran as well, as we know. And so plenty of evidence of these countries being duplicitous and playing both sides. And in 1980, Iran even bombed, Israel bombed Iraq's nuclear reactor at Osirak. And in June 81, Israel bombed Iraq's nuclear reactor at Osirak. The parts were supplied by France. So, and then we also have an Italian report of the Israelis supplying 45,000 Uzi machine guns, anti-tank missile launchers, missiles, and howitzers to Iran. So a lot of what we see, as also is documented elsewhere, Israel is not the only person or country certainly involved in arming Iran during this period when supposedly they were this arch terrorist regime. Israel and the United States certainly being notable examples in the policies are obvious for all these countries in spite of public denials. But then the interesting thing is that these reports have continued to filter in over the years, once again having less to do with necessarily conspiracy but corruption. In 1998, Israeli court sentenced an Israeli businessman for selling Iran components for chemical weapons. And then back as once again after the tail end of the Iran-Iraq War, 1989, Israeli dealers tried to sell sarin gas to Iran, but as I said, the Iranian regime was not so much interested. 1991, 1994, they continued efforts to try and sell them this gas, and Israel halted when gas started showing up in Hezbollah hands in Lebanon. So interesting, once again, these arms a little short-sighted when they're out there trying to market them, and then things change when all of a sudden they find them showing up in Lebanon in Hezbollah hands. And then in 2002, we also have Israeli shipments of weapons and parts to Iran that were intercepted in Germany, and the pattern goes on. We've also had stories recently that involve the same sort of pattern. So this is going back 30, 40 years now, arms from Israel showing up in Iran. In the Telegraph in February of 2014, we had the Department of Homeland Security find that Israeli arms dealers were sending spare jet parts to Iran in breach of sanctions. And it gets complicated then because we end up finding U.S. parts. And so theoretically there would be more interest in the fact that U.S. military technology is reaching Iran in this last year, particularly in light of the fact that some of these parts may end up being in equipment that is being used in Syria. And then also there's been interceptions in Greece of weapons from Israel to Iran in December 2012 and April 2014 now. And U.S. intelligence seems to say, quote, they no doubt they are colluding with Israeli intelligence, unquote. And so there we have it, kind of a interesting little glimpse of what goes on in the real world in the midst of all this public posturing, in the midst of all this politicking, in the midst of all this geopolitics, in the midst of all this war and conflict. There's oil, there's money, there's weapons, and we have conspiracy, we have corruption, we have business intersecting with military elements, we have government and military and business intersecting, and all bets are off. And that's how things work in the real world. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.